Dana to find us. So I'm Charlie Thomas. I'm the executive director of ACTC. If the link was bad, which that may have been our problem, that's my fault. If the same link sent us to 2 different meetings, that is in no way that I know my fault. But in either case, apologies for the inconvenience. And thank you so much for being here. Core Conversations gives us an opportunity to see each other even when we can't travel to be together. But it is worth noting that we will have an opportunity to be together around the same tables in the same spaces very soon. And I hope that you all can join us April 21st through 24th at the University of Notre Dame for our annual meeting. This will be the first time in 3 years that we've had an opportunity to be together face to face for a meeting, and I know many of you are really looking forward to that. Proposals are currently being accepted online, and registration is open. So please, let us know what you'd like to do. If chatting with me about topics or panels would be helpful, I'm doing a lot of that lately, and I'd love to talk to you about your thoughts on what you might do at our conference at Notre Dame in April. Also currently open is nominations for students to participate in our undergraduate conference, also in April, but a little bit earlier. Our undergraduate conference will be April 1st and 2nd at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Professor Michael Crom is spearheading that event with my support, and it's going to be great. Professor Crom, Michael, and I worked together on the online student conference last year, and it went very well. So bringing people together live is going to only make that better. So last little bit of preliminary, and then I'll hand it over to Phil. We try to replicate, a free-flowing conversation as much as we can, but that's difficult in Zoom. If more than one person has their microphone unmuted, we can have feedback issues, and sometimes it's difficult to know who's talking, and especially since we have such good attendance today. So it's probably a good idea to use the raise hand function or to use the chat. I'll keep my chat box open to let me know if you'd like to break into conversation, and I will be sure to pull you in. And if we can be more free form without stepping on each other's toes, we can sort of morph into that mode. I don't need to moderate this except to manage the technological limitations of Zoom. So I'm going to hand it over to Phil for just a minute to kind of remind us of what he presented, just very briefly. And then the floor is open for questions. If you already know you want to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and that'll be we'll call on you as soon as Phil's ready to take those to begin talking about those questions. So Phil, thanks again for your lovely remarks and for being willing to do one of these. I've enjoyed very much thinking about all of the many interesting things you presented, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to say something I just learned yesterday afternoon in another Zoom meeting, which is, I should have known this long ago, but I did not. If you want to raise your hand, go under the screen there to where reactions is, the little reaction box, and hit that, and then there'll be a place on there to, quote, raise your cyber hand. And then Charlie, then everybody can see that you would like to speak. I'm sure everybody already knew that, but just because I didn't, I thought I would pass my little bit of lore along. So the remarks that I recorded back on November 11th were centered on the notion of the asymmetry of the human face. There's Dana. Hi, Dana. And the probably what I'm trying to connect with in the remarks that I made is the relationship between that asymmetry and the notion of infinity in some of the theological allusions that I cite, and how exactly that connection works. I think I do have a few thoughts on that, but I'd be interested in hearing what each of you has to say. So why don't we start by just opening it up to whomever would like to make a remark. Now, as I understand this is not so much a question and answer to me, but a conversation among ourselves. So however it goes, it goes. Now, I want to invite Charlie to start with a comment, and something she mentioned when we were making the recording. And it's something that I have been thinking about, especially recently. She mentioned that in her last look at Montaigne, do you remember this, Charlie? There was a passage in there where he apparently was in some danger of his life in a situation where there were soldiers around, and he felt like his life was being threatened. And I'm going to, before I say anything more and mix it all up, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie and ask her if she would add that on to what was in the recorded remarks.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so there are actually 2 episodes, but I'm sorry I didn't prepare well enough to tell you precisely what essays these are in. Maybe someone else in the chat can nail that down for us. But there are 2 episodes that I was thinking of, and in one of them he mentions the face specifically and credits it, and the other, I think it's more implied, but also an important part of the episode. In the case where he mentions the face explicitly, he's taken as a prisoner of war, and he's actually found out away from his property and surrounded, and he says, and they release him, and he says that the reason that they released him was because of his face. So that's a pretty, and he says it straightforwardly, that was his understanding of the reason that he was released. The other one is another story where he is at home, and someone comes to the door saying that they're in distress, that they're being chased. They come into his house. Another soldier follows short, and he lets them in, invites them in. Another soldier follows shortly behind, and then several more, until he realizes, and he reminds, he's reminded that he knew that this was a strategy for taking over houses and property, was this sort of pretending to be in distress until your house is already occupied with soldiers, who then announce that they weren't actually in distress, they were just trying to occupy your home without doing any more violence. And that happens to him, to the point that the officer shows up, and Montaigne at this point knows that that's the next move, is they're just going to tell him to leave, that they have commandeered his home. But he continues to treat them with hospitality, and I do believe his face or his visage or something is, his comportment is mentioned, and they leave. As he sort of treats them as a guest, as he treats them as guests, they decide to treat him as a host, and they leave, and they don't occupy his house. So in these two episodes, the one he mentions his face very precisely, and the other I think he mentions it a little bit more obliquely, but he credits his face with saving him. And I'd love to hear what Phil or others think about that.
I'm just going to say one thing to that, Charlie, and then pass along the chance to speak to anyone else who would like to. Levinas, actually in the book Totality and Infinity, late in the book, he says that the only imperative not to murder as in the sixth commandment, lo tirtzach. That commandment, the basis of that is the human face. He said, in the human face is a prohibition against murder. So just having said that with no further explanation, I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts they'd like to bring up here.
Dan, and let me just say, when we begin to talk, unmute yourself, please. But if you're not speaking, please do mute yourself. We have a little bit of background noise happening, and that's just can be distracting. So, Dan, please, and then Paige, and then
Dan. The other pro tip is that you have to lower your hand, or else it stays up forever. So you look like that eager student who won't quit. Well, I was just going to supply the very point that Phil just made, that Levinas says the face is the absolute obstacle to murder, the sight of which causes the assassin's hand to drop, which isn't actually true, or isn't true enough, but you can see a truth in it. And I just wanted to say to Phil, what an extraordinary talk that was. It was just fabulous. And I'm wondering two small things, whether you did the same exercise and would recommend that we do it with all of Rembrandt's self-portraits, and would we notice the same asymmetries and what we might see, for example, in the older Rembrandt. But I also just want to recommend, if you don't know it, this I think remarkable book by Roger Scruton called The Face of God, which was the Gifford lectures from maybe 15 years ago. And it has a long section on the face of the person, which begins with Levinas, a different quote than the one that you made, but ranges over many of the same thinkers, and has, I think, a similar thesis, but not so much connected to asymmetries, just as to the uniqueness of the face in the body, because he quotes Dante about the eyes and the mouth being the balconies of the soul. And he says quite interesting things about the face being the revelation of the self, and a revelation that has a transcendental quality, because the neuroscientists can't make sense out of it, and the scientists can't make sense out of the face when they, reduce the portrait to pigment on the canvas. They can never capture it adequately. I thought of all of those things listening to your really stimulating talk.
Phil or Paige?
I'll jump in. Phil, of course, I loved the talk. It was wonderful, as Dan has pointed out, and that's just a fact. It will not be contested. You did a great talk. Towards the end, Phil, you were moving in the direction of thingness, humanity, people versus thing, and I got interested in that. And I'm not a philosopher, but I began to think about the nature of things, and I was remembering German phrases that I never understood to begin with, the Ding an sich and Ding für sich, or whatever that was, and wondering how that related to your concept of things. And you had brought in so many sources that were interesting. And then your finally, one of your final examples from the Holocaust, Wie viel Stück, was devastating. It was a very good example of humans reduced to things. I think it also probably relates to race and all the crisis we're experiencing in that realm politically. And I think your talk also relates to masking and the crisis we're having over that. You know, what is it that when you mask the human face, you're abusing it in some way, but paradoxically here for a good cause that promotes humanity. So figure out all of that, Phil, and let us know what the answer is.
I have a couple thoughts actually occurred to me after my 2 cups of coffee this morning. One of which is that Levinas says some surprising things about the face, which is he does not limit it to the anatomical face, the 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. He gives one example of standing behind a woman outside of a prison. I think it was somewhere actually somewhere in Russia. He's standing outside of a prison where a woman is there in a line waiting to receive any news that she can get of her husband who's incarcerated in there. And then she receives the news, which is, I guess, not good news, and her shoulders just go down. And he's standing behind her. And he gives that as an example of a face, which is something that expresses that which is within or that which is behind it more. And he does not say, but it occurred, I would just put out, I think I mentioned it briefly in the recorded remarks, but I would just say one other thing that I've been thinking about lately, which is it could even be in a piece of music. One of the striking things about Stravinsky was when he started really as a complete innovation on his own part of composing music in 2 different keys at the same time. The Firebird and also the Rite of Spring that's an important compositional technique in both of those pieces, as I understand it. And that strikes me again as an example of asymmetry, where neither aspect of the composition can be completed in the other aspect. And what that does is it, if I could put it this way, it arrests the mind, it stops the mind. It stops all of this inertial, you might say subconscious, even prejudicial procedures of our minds, because our mind cannot synthesize into one thing these 2 aspects, which are therefore present to us, present in the sense of we can't synthesize them away. We can't put them together in a way that dismisses them from further consideration. We can't finish with them, if I could put it that way. And then just one last thought here. Toward the end of the remarks, I talk about a possibility of what I would call a metaphysical intuition, not spatial and not temporal, but something. And I bring the phrase durcheinander, one thing through another. Now, in colloquial German, durcheinander means confused or chaotic. You say, das ist doch alles durcheinander, which means it's a total mess. You can't make heads or tails out of it. But I think that there's a positive sense to it that is, in spite of the common usage in German, where one thing can be seen through another. As I keep thinking about these things, that strikes me as an interesting possibility for us. Dana, what were you thinking here?
I was thinking as I listened to the lecture and looked at the pictures, there is something essentially human in the face, and it is, I have been told, read, that it's the focusing on the face is pretty much the first thing that a newborn is able to do, to focus on the human face. So it's primordial. It's very deeply in us to relate to the human face. But in the lecture, we were looking at paintings, and that seems to me a very different thing in a couple respects from looking at a human face. What the infant, if the infant looks at the mother's face, in that, first of all, it's an image or an imitation of an imitation. So we've got we're not looking at a human being. We're looking at a painting. So that's one thing. It's already not the thing itself. And also, it is the thing about the human is that human is representing herself. And it is that being, that human being that is presenting herself. And what we have with the painting is we have the painter, the artist, making a representation. And even if there is a model there, and it may even be that we're impressed by how the painter captured what we see in real life, if we have occasion to see that in real life. But it could be another thing, which is, I shouldn't say thing, but it is a thing. It's a painting. It's not the human. It's not the one with it's not the ensouled being there. And that just seems to, many of the things you brought out are still going to apply and teach us how to look at people, even in real life. But I wonder what's lost, or what do we have to set aside, that this is the artist's presentation instead of the human being.
Anybody have thoughts on that question?
She sounds like Socrates fussing about mimesis and stuff. Does that come into your mind, Dana?
Yes, I think that's one of the pieces, that it's a copy of a copy, or an image of an image.
Dana, I don't have so much the yips about that as I'm hearing in your question, in the sense that I don't mean for these paintings that I referred to be replacements for an actual human face, but more instructive in how to look at an actual human face. And in that sense, at least to me, I think they have been instructive. I should make some probably embarrassing admissions here, but once I got, I won't say obsessed with this subject, but once I got entangled with this subject, I actually spent quite a bit of time out on the streets looking at the faces of dogs to see if there was any analog there. And mostly there is not. But every now and then every now and then, there is a dog that has an extraordinary expressiveness. But because of bone structure, or sometimes even just the color of the fur, where there's just an interesting offset of one side against the other side. But I think my main interest here is not in these paintings, but just to use them as ways of presenting highly simplified versions of what it might be possible to see in the face of another actual human being. I can say one other thing. One text I did not bring up, but was in the background all the time when I've been thinking about this, is the second sentence of the book of first chapter of Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was desolate and empty." And then there's a very striking phrase. It just says, "Hoshech al panei tzahom," darkness on the face of the deep. And in the various commentaries I've read, almost nobody ever comments on that phrase. They're so interested in what came just before that. But that's the first step after the beginning sentence: darkness, hoshech al panei tzahom. And then the next step is the Spirit of God, merakefes al panei hamayim, again on the face of the waters. So in both of those sentences, in both of those structures, there's a sense of a surface behind which is something that comes through the surface. And that is, I guess, in the simplest way I can say it, that is what is involved in the notion of a face, of a human face.
In the chat, sorry, Dana, you first, and then I'll just encourage David Depew, who added something to the chat. If you'd like to follow up, that would be great. But sorry, Dana, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I acknowledged that, and I do think it has been very useful to do this exercise with the paintings, and I understand that, but I kept thinking, if only we could be looking at a real person, not a constructed person, which may or may not be accurate to the human that was behind it. It has just a bit of thinging, the human being that was the model, and it's interesting in all those, and instructive in all those ways. What I was thinking, maybe we should hold up a mirror and put the card in front of the left and right and see what things we can discover with ourselves or with another actual human being. Anyway, that was just this thought that your ideas were stimulating for me.
Thank you, Dan.
David, would you like to follow up, or just let your comment?
I was responding to the idea that mimesis sort of gets in the way. I think that the Eastern Orthodox idea of icon as opposed to image is designed to break that down. And I think it's also really, really deeply connected to the complete reversal of the concept of person, where you just translated that Septuagint Greek from the Genesis as a prosopon, the face. That reverses into from being a mask and therefore an obscuring of somebody's public identity to a deeper sense of what a person is that's available through the iconicity of painting. So I would like to think of Rembrandt as kind of iconic.
Josh, why don't you jump in, and then if those of you on the chat would like to follow up, please just let me know or raise your hand, but I won't put you on the spot otherwise. Thank you though, David. Josh?
Jason, your hand was up a minute ago. Did you still want to speak?
Yeah, I would love to ask a question, Phil. I'm wondering if you detect a difference between the self-portraits and the portraits of, you know, distinctly others in the examples that you chose. If there's a sadness or an impossibility that the self-portraits just describe, in that there may be too much of a familiarity with the self that is maybe absent the engagement that the artist might have in seeing a face of someone not himself. Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's something about the self-portrait that either might be inherently challenging for an artist of the caliber that you were holding up as examples.
You know, this is not in any way, I hope, a deflection from your question, but it's a remark by Van Gogh on his self-portrait. And his remark was that it's a self-portrait because he could not afford a model. His preference would have been to paint somebody else's face, but he just didn't have even the means to hire a person to sit for him. I'm not sure if there is anything beyond that with Rembrandt. And no, as in response to an earlier question, no, I haven't looked at very many Rembrandt self-portraits. This just happens to be the one that's in the Met, and the Met is where I haunt these paintings. So that's the one that I've looked at the most. But it's a very, very interesting question. I sometimes have posed the question to myself, Jason, and I have not been able to answer it. If I saw a portrait, would I be able to distinguish just on the merits of the portrait without any outside information? Would I be able to distinguish, to know if it was a self-portrait or not, or if it was a portrait of another person? And I don't think that I can say, yes, I could make that distinction at this point. I would love to be able to, but so far I can't say that I would know how to do that.
Thanks.
Josh, your hand is up?
Sure, Phil. So I'll start with a painterly question, even though I know absolutely nothing about painting. The issue of foreground, what's in the foreground and what's in the background, or to put it differently, what's in light and what is in shadow. It seems to me that's dictating to a very great extent the asymmetry that you're talking about. And I just wonder whether you've thought about that. That is, what kind of impact it has on this reflection about asymmetry and having to put together.
A little bit I have, mostly with in relation to the Velázquez portrait of Juan de Parejo. And what I have always felt about that portrait, because that's the one in which one of the subject's eyes is looking directly, as it were, at the viewer of the painting. And the other eye is looking past the viewer of the painting, like over the shoulder, off into the background. And what that does for me, what that painting does for me, is it places me in the same undefined context that Juan de Parejo himself is sitting in. There's almost no detail in the background of that painting. It's just vague, mysterious, if I could use that word, context for him. And I feel like the way that he is in the painting looking at me puts me in that same context as he is. So that's the one case where I think that there's a very, very interesting and simple and powerful use of what is almost no context at all. It's just featureless areas, very, very interesting, but no objects back there to identify with.
So one other more philosophic question is about the passages you referred to and the way in which you're trying to use the paintings as a leaping off point for what you referred to as metaphysical intuition. So part of what so this may just be picking at nits, but as I think back to Plato's use of the summoners in the Republic, the main point that he's making about the three fingers is to try to draw your attention to the fact that though your senses cannot distinguish the fact that your middle finger is larger than one of your other fingers, but smaller than the other, that's supposed to lead you to reference to intellect. And the suggestion is that you're supposed to be able to see that it's the same finger that has a different relation to two things. Your senses don't reveal that to you, but your intellect does. So part of the difficulty with that passage in the Republic is that it's actually, I think, trying to reinforce that which is rationally comprehensible. Whereas I think what you're suggesting about the paintings and your overall point is to point to a metaphysical intuition of something that is transcendent. That seems to me to be doing something very different. It's pointing beyond the rationally comprehensible.
First of all, thank you for bringing up that issue. And yes, you've got me correctly diagnosed. That in fact, that is what I intended. But I would try to enlist Plato on my side on this. And the way I would try to do this, I don't know if this will have any effect or not, is that I think what you say is quite right, that it is an appeal to the realm of the intellect as opposed to the realm of sensation and perception. And I think that's the way that passage reads. But I think that where you and I probably don't quite read it the same way is that the realm of the intellect for Plato is not necessarily the realm of rational, logical consistency, self-consistency. I think there's a number of cases where there's profound inconsistencies that are presented that cannot be made into one thing. And Levinas, I think it's appropriate that I keep bringing him up because he's really the author that got me started thinking about this many years ago. But he refers to the passage in the Republic where the good is beyond the divided line. It's not on the divided line. The whole divided line, the whole map of consciousness, if I could put it that way, comes from it. and depends on it, but it itself is not on the map. And in that sense, the word beyond, I think, is even a fair translation of Plato's Greek at that point. That's the dreaded word of transcendence. Something is beyond or possibly within, but inaccessibly within. So I don't know, Josh, if that's the beginnings of a response to the issue that you raised, but I think the issue is exactly what I've been thinking about.
Yes, I'm going to jump in. Oh, sorry. Did I just talk on?
No.
Okay, so just jump in before I get to you, Paige. I hope you're okay with that. But two quick things. One on that point that you guys were just talking about, the three fingers point, and the other on something far more mundane. But you know, I one of the connections I made, whether this is true to the nuances of the summoners in Plato or not, we would have to talk about for a long time, I think. But yeah, if you have the three fingers and you say, is the middle finger larger or smaller? You know, the answer is yes, right? Yes, it's larger than the one and smaller than the other, and it's both. And it's the presentation and the frame that allows you to kind of take something very simple and understand. And I think that's the role of the intellect, obviously, is very important here. Understand something more. And one of the things that I think, just in terms of the way that these paintings function in the ways that you're describing, less than getting all the way to the bottom of the meaning, but this idea that you would paint the same person at two different ages, you know, in the case of Cezanne's wife, or both desperate and perhaps resigned, or I'm trying to remember some of the juxtapositions right now, but it's this way of taking a face and saying, is it this or that? And the painting saying yes. Yes, and in that sense, it does look to me, whether it's precise or not, to be following the sort of the summoning dynamic within Plato, is that we don't want to call the face a thing, but the painting itself, the face itself, is in the way that it's portrayed, is pushing you toward understanding that there is more to it than is portrayed. And that's just technically, as a way of doing that in two dimensions, is really striking, and I'm seeing it everywhere now. And so I wanted to thank you for that. So that's the more apt comment. The mundane comment is, I found myself doing this thing, and I bet others of you have too, and I don't understand it. And that is, when I teach students who wear masks all the time, I don't realize until I see them without their masks that I've sort of imaginatively, even though I'm not aware of it, created a vision of the bottom of their faces, so that when I see them, it's not just, oh, that's what the bottom of your face looks like. My immediate reaction is, oh, that's not what the bottom of your face looks like. And so I wonder, it is a very serious question, because I would never have imagined that would be something that I would do, would be to create something without being aware that I was creating it to fill that space that is withheld from me. And yet I'm clearly doing it all the time. And I'm not sure whether we can talk about this in this context, but it does seem tangentially related and very curious and mysterious to me.
Paige?
My comment goes back further into the discussion, but also relates to Charlie's thoughts a little bit, I think. One thing we hadn't mentioned when it comes to self-portraiture is the function of the mirror. The mirror mediates even a self-portrait, and somehow that seems to me, it reminds me that, you know, how do you see yourself? Is it not completely impossible to see yourself, whether you use a natural you know, look in the water like Narcissus or in a mirror. But the mediation that art requires seems to somehow relate to this. And I haven't figured out quite how, and wondered if other people had thoughts on that. And of course, there are other kinds of mediation besides the mirror itself, and many portraits that depict the artist looking in a mirror, as you all know.
I wish someone else would jump in, but very, very quickly on that point, this goes back to the self-portrait question. I think maybe that, in a really interesting way, because I think painting yourself in a mirror might be different than painting yourself, doing a self-portrait without, but I'm not sure exactly how that would work.
Matthew S. Has a hand up there.
I don't know if you guys can hear me well. My earbuds have been spotty with the microphone.
We can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I've been wrestling with this question of almost a Platonic question of what role imagery has in defining this thing that refuses thingness and helping us kind of transcend and move into the intellect. And on the idea of self-portraiture and mirrors, I'm reminded of my absolute favorite art history term, which is mise en abîme, which means to place into the abyss. And the best example I can think of this is Jan Vermeer's Arnolfini portrait, where if you look in the back, there's a fisheye lens kind of behind the woman in center stage. And in this fisheye lens, Jan van Eyck places himself into the portrait. He paints himself painting the portrait in this mirror in the very back. And it's just a beautiful phrase to place yourself into the abyss, which is tangentially at least related to this, the role of the artist and self-portraiture and mirrors. But I'm just forever curious about, you know, how we define this thing that refuses thingness, the face, and whether imagery can really help us with metaphysical cognition.
It is 5 minutes after 1. We started late, so I think it's okay for us to continue a little longer, but we probably only have time for a few more comments or responses. So, but there is no one in the queue right now, except Scott. Please jump in.
Scott, you're on. You're
muted.
You're muted.
Got it. Listen, one of the things that I guess has been spanning this conversation has been a question first raised, I think, by Dan when he suggested that we might want to have several portraits of Rembrandt, not just one to look at, which of course suggests that what Phil was looking at in one portrait might or be more developed or might not be as developed or might not even be present, which then suggests, of course, that there's this sort of, that there's a sequence to possibly a life or a sequence to characters. Beyond that, it seems to me that the whole discussion has been in some senses about learning that might go on in our classrooms. So I guess my question is, take a person like Amy Silman, who does abstract paintings and she does a lot of portraiture. And you look at her portraits and they're incredibly diverse. And if you spend a lot of time on them, you really begin to see how the artistry of it affects what we see, as it were, of the human face. The possibilities, the likelihoods, the the similarities, possibly the differences to people, at least amongst portraits. So is it part of a liberal arts training to actually have some training in portraiture that ought to be part and parcel, leading not, obviously both to metaphysical questions and to questions of character, but to, as it were, an appreciation or understanding of what can be revealed through images rather than through words. And I think I'd like Phil at least to address that for a minute, if he would.
I will, Scott, but I want to bring Michael Minogue into it first, and then I'll try to have something to say about that.
Thank you, Phil. My question may address Mr. Scott Lee's question as well, and I'm looking for your response, Phil. By the way, it's good to see you. You're not in New York City right now, are you?
Only in aspiration.
We'll come back to that at a separate time. But Matthew was saying something about images or icons. I was taking, helping us get into this metaphysical place, perhaps. I thought of churches, Catholic churches in particular. But, and since, childhood, you can do that to some extent, or try to do it. But I'm wondering if in your initial talk, Phil, you were speaking about coincidences and opposites, or the coincidence of opposites. And then you went into Plato's Republic there, and the summoning, the summoners of thought, which I guess these opposites are. Then you began to speak about the divine and the metaphysics. And I'm wondering, I may have just missed something there, or what's that connection? We're looking for this as part of this question, but I was wondering how you made it in your talk. You made the connection from the summoners of thought, and then you went to God. Now, I thought of Aristotle saying, to think of the divine is to be closer to the divine. But are you saying that just thinking is an act that will bring you closer to the divine? Thinking in general will either lead there logically, or is it a divine act in itself? Or did I miss something that was a connector?
No, I think, let me try to say this both in response to you, Michael, and also in response to Scott. I don't propose that just thinking will get you anywhere. It has to be thinking about, let's say, two aspects of what you're thinking about that are both present, but that cannot be made into a single thing, cannot be synthesized into what Kant would call a synthesized manifold, or again, using Kant's language, cannot be subsumed under a concept. I have a number of examples of such things where they both are and are not. But it seems to me that this is the issue that Josh raised earlier in this conversation about whether or not there is any such thing as a metaphysical intuition, not a metaphysical thought or a metaphysical concept. Those, I think we have our bookshelves full of metaphysical thoughts and metaphysical concepts, but this is different. This is a metaphysical intuition as an analog to spatial intuition and temporal intuition in Kant. And my own penchant here is to say, I think we should seriously consider that there might be metaphysical intuition. And what would be the hallmark of it? it would be a structure of consciousness that cannot be synthesized into a single thing, but nevertheless occurs together, it belongs together. And that in ordinary experience, the primary locus of this, I do think, is the human face, the anatomical human face, although there are other places you can come across this. But whether this should, on Scott's question, as I understood it, whether this should be brought into the curriculum, so to speak, and we should encourage young people to look at portraits. I'm not sure about that. I can't see any harm in it, but I think also people just looking at portraits could become just a version of curiosity, like what did this person look like? What did that person look like? And that's what a person looks like is not what I think is the main intrigue with the Rembrandt and the Van Gogh and the couple other paintings that I mentioned. There, I think, for me, at least, the main intrigue is there's no way to put the two aspects, in those cases, the two sides of the human face, together into one thing, and yet they are inseparable. They don't just belong together. You can't get them apart from each other, but they also cannot be made into one thing. And that's what introduces the word beyond or above into one's approach to these things. And that's where the metaphysics comes about, because the physics part of it can't be resolved into a completely coherent structure or a completely coherent experience. So the physics part of it then becomes one enormous suggestion of what might be beyond physics, in that sense, what might be metaphysical. It's a big issue. Kant, I think, is very clear on the fact that we have no metaphysical intuitions. That's why our minds can have no access to what he calls the thing in itself, the inwardness of anything. We just have phenomena, and we spend our time as best we can analyzing and organizing the phenomena that we are familiar with into patterns and into laws, but we don't have any insight into the inwardness of not only the other person, but the inwardness of the world itself. And I'm putting this out there as my little homespun response to that, is saying, well, perhaps we should reopen the question. And it's basically a defense of the words beyond and above.
I wonder, Kant does leave one thing open that I wrestle with often, and I think it's related. And he says, reason itself wants to know. He puts reason in a box and metaphysics outside the box, and we should stay in that box. But reason itself wants to get outside the box, and that's a paradox for me.
I think perhaps we should stop here. It's about we've been together about an hour, even with the delay taken into consideration. There are a couple of people who were interested in getting in on the conversation, and apologies to them. I'm sure Phil would be happy to hear from you. and to talk more about this with you, or come to Notre Dame in April and we can all sit down around a table and talk about it together. But for now, we need to bring this to a close. So please join me in whichever way you'd like, and to thank Phil for this wonderful conversation and remarks. Thank you so much, Phil. For those of you who tuned in today but did not watch Phil's remarks, they will stay up on our YouTube channel, so they're accessible to you, and this conversation will be up there too, in case there was some part of this that you'd like to go back to. We have more core conversations coming up in January. Please keep your eye out. Simi Ali of the Dallas Institute will be talking about Homer on January 21st. In February, Krishnan Venkatesh of St. John's Santa Fe, Phil's colleague, will be talking about Sima Qian, the Chinese historian. And in March 11th, Mary Townsend from St. John's University in New York will be talking about Simone de Beauvoir. So it's a great lineup this year, and would love to see you guys back for that. So thanks again, Phil. Thanks everyone for coming.
Charlie,
yes.
I also just say thank you to
Sure.
everybody who has been so kind as to be interested in this and to show up today on what I'm sure is otherwise a very busy day for everybody. Now, I noticed just before Charlie started speaking that there were 3 or 4 of you who had your hands up, your cyber hands up, and I don't know if you wanted to address any further remarks to me, but if you do, my email's right on my my little Zoom box there. Just my last name at sjc.edu, and I will reply if you want to continue some aspect of this conversation through email.
Thanks again, Phil, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Happy holidays. Bye.